Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
America's export of soybeans helps the U.S. maintain a positive agricultural trade balance. Nebraska contributes half of its soybeans for export. The protein and oil content in soybeans enhance the growing demand for higher protein diets. The Nebraska Soybean Board promotes research to develop new soybean varieties with higher protein and oil content for major agricultural markets. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We're coming to you from the top of the Scottsbluff National Monument as we report on continuing drought here in the Nebraska Panhandle. The overwhelming majority of this area has been in some form of drought since the end of March 2012. Our trip this week took us to the 2013 wheat variety tour at the High Plains Ag Lab near Sidney, the UNL Extension Center in Kimball County, and the Panhandle Research and Extension Center in Scottsbluff. On this episode, we'll look at wheat and alfalfa issues with Jeff Bradshaw. Dennis Stroud from the Pathfinder Irrigation District talks about water allocations farmers here in this region will face. Aaron Berger in Kimball describes current pasture and rangeland conditions, and Brad Lubben explains the future for a new farm bill. Ron Plain is our marketing analyst this week. The latest sterling profit trackers for pork and beef illustrate a major difference in margins. The average pork farrow to finish margin for the week ending June 21st was in the black at nearly $25 a head, while the average beef feed yard margin showed a loss of more than $178 per animal. We talked with Ron Wednesday afternoon about the inventory of U.S. hogs, pork prices in the grocery store, and why cattle and hog producers are living on opposite sides of the bottom line.
One of the interesting things about the red meat industry is the seasonal patterns. In the case of fed cattle, we often have our lowest prices of the year during the summer months, a little bit extra supply, slaughter tends to pick up a bit, and we get the opposite situation in the hog markets. Normally the lowest slaughter rates of the year come in the summer months. June's odds-on favorite for the highest hog prices of the year, and so kind of headed in opposite directions right now.
So nothing more than seasonality really fueling the hog market?
Well, that plus, as it turns out, we've slaughtered a fewer hogs than we thought we was going to. USDA's March hog inventory report was a little bit high as far as a prediction on slaughter during the March, April, May time frame, and so low hog numbers and lower numbers than we expected is a big part of what's fueling these strong hog prices.
What are you looking at right now for break even in the hog market?
Well, somewhere in the low 70s on a live weight basis, mid 90s on a carcass weight basis is what it takes to cover the cost of production here in early summer. Hopefully we'll see that decline as we move on towards fall and get a little bit of a break on feed costs.
Any change in your thoughts on what might happen here in terms of how many months a hog producer can be profitable here in 2013?
Well, we're getting better. May only lost about $11 per head for hogs. That was the 10th consecutive monthly loss. Looks like June may eke out a little bit of a profit, hopefully again in July and August. And then the question becomes what's going to happen to feed costs. There's a good chance that if growing conditions stay good, we'll see feed costs decline. Even though we're likely to see hog prices decline, we may hang on to profits for most of the rest of the year.
You look in the supermarket right now or in the grocery store, and what are you seeing for retail pork prices? Is there any chance that they might make a new record high?
Well, we've had records on wholesale pork belly prices and butt prices. Boston butts have been at record levels. The drag has been pork loins haven't been all that strong, but yes, there's a chance. The total cutout value has been within 2 to 3 cents per pound of the record, so we may yet have a record highs for pork prices this summer.
All right, and finally, in summation, what's the overall outlook here as we go forward over the next month for the hog market?
Well, we're probably close to the peak. Normally, once you get past middle of August, it's downhill. Weights start to pick up and daily slaughter tends to pick up. So we've got another 6 weeks or so for hopefully some strong, profitable hog prices. Beyond that, look for prices to decline. Normally, somewhere around the first day of December gets you the lowest hog prices of the year.
Since our weekly Market Journal taping takes place before Friday at noon, we're unable to cover the USDA reports on grain stocks and planted acres. We did, however, talk with John Moret from J.E. Moret Grain Company after the releases. You can find that interview on the Market Journal website and Facebook page. The current Farm Bill expires at the end of September, or rather the current extension to last year's Farm Bill expires at the end of September. Late last week, members of the House voted down their version after the Senate passed its own. Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid said this week his colleagues won't pass another extension. Brad Lubben joined us Thursday in Lincoln to talk about the breakdown of new legislation and where the Farm Bill goes from here.
Well, you know, after a few days of debate and looking like good progress towards final consideration, then the final vote falls apart. Frankly, there's enough blame to go around pretty much on all sides. Democrats voted against the final bill en masse. Only 24, maybe from the most rural Democratic districts in the country, voted for it. We knew most Democrats were going to vote against it. They had argued, certainly from the far left wing at least, that nutrition cuts were far too much, could not vote for a bill like that. The far right wing of the Republican Party voted against the bill. Not enough spending cuts, not enough nutrition cuts, perhaps not even enough cuts on the farm side. So we knew part of the far right wing was going to fall apart as well. It had to be a middle-of-the-road bipartisan coalition to pass a bill. And in the end, it might in fact be the House leadership that allowed an open vote process, which sounds very good and democratic, but it also allowed certain votes that conservative Republicans voted for, but then voted against the overall bill. That's enough to kill a bill in the end.
So we're kind of in the same place we were a year ago, where the Senate has passed its bill and the House hasn't been able to do anything on their end. The discussion this morning is that the House might decide to try to split this bill apart into farm programs and nutrition. Is there any possibility to that happening? You
know, that's been a pushed position from some of the right wing before, and it was a proposed amendment that was ruled out of order and not considered during the House floor debate. But if you separate nutrition funding, which is 70 to 80% of the total bill, from the rest of the Farm Bill, the rest of the Farm Bill looks pretty small. It doesn't look like as big a target for spending cuts. On the other hand, it also has a hard time finding support. And so even as much as the debate has been about how much you cut from nutrition versus the rest of the bill, the farm community typically has said we've got to keep these things together because without the Farm Food Coalition, there's not enough farm interest alone to push that legislation forward.
So where do we go from here, Mr. Lubben?
Well, that's a great question. I think we've been asked that one before.
Sure.
But if we speculate again this go-round, here we are, 4th of July time period. The House isn't going to bring it back up anytime before then. There has been discussion this week about the schedule ahead. You could imagine the House bringing a bill back to the floor minus the controversial amendments. You could imagine the House maybe going directly to a conference with the Senate to try and negotiate a compromise bill based on the Senate version. You could imagine this process dragging on until we start having to talk about expiration of current policy, permanent legislation taking effect, the need for an extension. I remain in the camp that says it looks very difficult to imagine an extension occurring because of the proposed reforms that have already been promised in the bill that don't happen with just an extension. How do you get those if you don't process the whole bill?
And the Senate has kind of stood its ground here and said they won't do it anyway.
The Senate at least has said they won't consider an extension. That's politically astute at this point to push the focus back to the House and force the House to do something. I believe we won't have another extension, at least not before the end of the year. Of course, I believe that last year too. So we did end up sneaking a 1-year extension on the bill at the very end of last year. That seems more difficult this go around. Maybe just enough impetus to get the final bill done this year.
We move now to the Panhandle. Nebraska range and pasture conditions improved last week, with 18% now in good or excellent condition. But almost 40% of the state's range and pasture is still in poor or very poor shape, and it's probably a safe bet that most of that is in the western half. We talked with Aaron Berger in Kimball Wednesday about the prospects for cattle on that land and how this area has recently fared in rainfall.
Precipitation has been really variable through the spring. Some areas have gotten some and other areas haven't, and so it's kind of a have and have-nots. We did get some moisture in late April and early May, and so that helped the cool season grass get started. One of the challenges is with the drought that we had last summer, and we're still with that. We saw a lot of grass that, even if it was managed well, we saw quite a bit of dieback and reduction in vigor. So even our cool season production, I think this year is maybe half of long-term average. And so as people are thinking about stocking for this summer and thinking about how long they leave cattle out and rotations, need to take that into account and just realize we're going to be short on grass even with some of the precipitation we've had.
With those dead plants, it's not an option to reseed in that?
Yeah, really reseeding in native range is a waste of money. And so if you have some weedy species, it is important to pay attention to those, especially for folks who maybe brought hay in from other locations last year that might have weeds. Now is a really good time to be watching for those, things like leafy spurge, Canada thistle. Those could be coming up, especially in pastures maybe they fed on. But going in and seeding into a pasture really has no value if you have a decent stand there of native plants that can come back and really fill in those spaces.
On average, what have producers done here with their herds? How far have they cut back?
I think on average, probably we're looking at a reduction around 30%. A lot of folks have worked hard to hold on to their cow herd, their base cow herd. And so a lot of folks have turned out. I still think this year early weaning is going to be a good option as a way to reduce forage demand, to try to stretch those forage supplies as much as possible. One of the advantages of this year, I think, maybe compared to next year, is the Corn Belt's got a lot of good moisture. And so some of these ethanol co-products are a little more cost competitive in terms of a feed resource than they were in the past. Out here, wheat harvest is about ready to start, and so there may be some wheat straw available. The opportunity to feed some ethanol co-products or soy hulls with some wheat straw if we need to get cattle off a pasture, especially to some cows, I think might be a good fit this year.
How far are you looking at early weaning? I mean, how early are we talking?
Yeah, really we can early wean calves as short as 60 days, but probably somewhere around that 80 to 110 days is really where it's a good fit. And so I think if you know you're going to be short on feed, just looking now at what your demand is and what you have available to you, you start to make some of those decisions. Especially some of these young cows, 2s and 3s, really can benefit from an early weaning type situation, allow them to get some body condition score back. And so I think those are things to put in your planning as you think about going through the summer.
Still anything to remember with time out grazing on that range?
Yeah, so as we think about these pastures and the range land, and especially those that have been stressed, anything we can do to defer grazing during the active growing season is going to help that pasture recover. That doesn't mean we can't graze it at all, but if we can avoid grazing those species when they're actively growing, we really can help the vigor of those plants. So for us in this area, we're pretty dominantly cool season. You get north and east of here in the Sandhills, this warm season. So we're looking at deferring grazing anything from May through July, August, into September. Once we get into a killing frost, then there's really not any detriment to going out and grazing those dormant plants, but anything we can do to defer grazing will help those pastures going forward, especially during the growing season.
Next week, we'll look at more beef conditions in the Panhandle as Carla Jenkins will talk with us about feeding cows in confinement. Bart Ruth, a former president of the American Soybean Association, has a keen perspective on production of biofuels from crops. In the June Nebraska Farmer, he reviews the status of 25 by 25, the broad coalition with a goal of producing 25% of this country's energy needs by 2025. Ruth farms near Rising City with his son Jeff and is a co-chairman of the 25 by 25 Alliance. Despite some policy setbacks, Ruth says the coalition is on track to meet its goal. In the June Nebraska Farmer, Ruth also talks about how agriculture must adapt to climate change. On our next episode, we'll take a look at the variation in Nebraska's 2013 wheat crop. Only 40% of that winter wheat was turning color as of the latest report. That's 17 percentage points behind the 5-year average. The state's alfalfa crop is rated with over half as either good or excellent. First cutting of alfalfa was recorded at 84%, with second cutting at 2%. At the wheat variety tour near Sydney, Jeff Bradshaw joined us to talk about alfalfa weevils in the panhandle and how a different insect may be impacting Nebraska's winter wheat.
So we've been monitoring wheat stem sawfly. We've got some pheromone traps that we've been working on and developing some different tools there. We've set out emergence cages and we've taken sweep samples. And this year so far, wheat stem sawfly numbers seem to be higher than they were last year.
Any reason behind that, do you think?
Well, we had a fairly warm, mild season last year, and wheat stem sawfly overwinters as a pupa. And if it's too warm in the spring, it'll just decide to not finish. And so it can actually carry over to the next year. So I think part of our issue this year is carryover from last year and just having a big emergence.
What's the damage that it does to wheat? I mean, what are you looking for in the plant?
Yeah, so the wheat stem sawfly, the adult lays an egg in the stem in a tiller, and the larva will feed inside. So there's a little bit of damage associated with that larval feeding activity. Majority of the damage comes when it goes to pupate, and in that process it girdles the stem, and with a little bit of wind it'll lodge.
So there's no treatment recommendation for this, or there's no option right now for treatment, correct?
That's correct. The adult doesn't really feed much as an adult, and then it emerges over a long period of time. The larva is protected inside the tiller. We don't really have any products that either can effectively time control or can get inside the stem to actually kill those larvae.
So you would have to go to a variety difference then?
That's right. So
at what level would you do that? You know, at what level of damage would you consider going to that the next year? Or the next year after that, I suppose.
Yeah, so typically what happens is sawflies infest wheat border areas, particularly with wheat, summer fallow wheat systems. And so border areas can be a good location just to plant a hard stem variety, like Genu, for example, would be one. And you'd really have to go on history. So if you've got a history of certain areas of the field that have high wheat stem sawfly infestation, and you've got, say, a no-till situation, then that might be a good target for some of those hard stem wheats. Because there's generally about a 10 to 20% yield drag on the hard stems, it might be wise not to plant an entire field to it.
Let's move on to something else. When we were on our way out here, we saw a lot of hay bales being made. If you're looking at alfalfa right now, how popular are the alfalfa weevils?
Yeah, well, they're not everyone's favorite right now. We've had a lot of issues throughout the panhandle. Recently talked to John Thomas, our extension educator up in Box Butte. And one of the issues that we've had is alfalfa weevil in regrowth. It was an issue before cutting. It's still an issue now with regrowth, particularly in areas that are a little bit water stressed anyway. And so there's a lot of growers, a lot of scouts trying to keep up with weevil.
Any options for the producer?
Yeah, there's some pretty good chemical controls that are available for alfalfa weevil. It's just timing and keep on top of scouting is important. And we're working within Extension to try to find better tools for scouting. Right now there is a neb guide that's available for alfalfa weevil, but it doesn't really have the best protocols available for regrowth and sampling regrowth. So we're working on those tools right now.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to Jeff's recent Crop Watch article regarding alfalfa weevils if you're interested in more information. While pockets of the Panhandle have received needed rains over the last few weeks, its total rainfall from June 1st, 2012 until May 31st, 2013 is less than half of what many areas of east and southeast Nebraska recorded over the same period. As some irrigating regions will face allocations this growing season, we talked about those limits this week with Dennis Stroud from the Pathfinder Irrigation District.
Our district basically starts at the Wyoming-Nebraska state line and runs about approximately 100 miles east to near Bridgeport, Nebraska. We provide irrigation water to about 100,000 acres in Nebraska, surface water. We also deliver to about 15,000 acres in Wyoming under a contract we have with those districts.
Just for perspective, what's the need for allocation along this region?
Normally, if we have a full irrigation supply, our average usage is in the 16 to 20 inch range, depending on how much rainfall we get.
But in a short year, why do you need to ratchet that down?
Well, in a short year, our allotment this year, our water supply is in about the 60% range. So our allotment to our producers right now is 13 inches. We're still receiving some runoff from snowmelt in the mountains, which we hope will help increase that supply and help us stretch out and maybe allocate another 2 or 3 inches if it's available.
So that's 13 inches per acre, essentially?
Per acre, yes.
How does that compare to what you saw last year around this time?
Well, I guess I go back to 2011. In 2011, we have water being released down the river the entire irrigation season. Into the season with above normal carryover in the reservoirs, everything looked really rosy for surface water irrigators here in the valley, and then last year hit. Extremely dry, extremely hot. Our irrigation demand come in late in mid-May, and it hung in there most of the season. We did shut off deliveries September 10th, but our water usage was probably pretty close to 20 inches or maybe even above a little bit.
Was there any desire from a crop producer for preseason irrigation, or from a producer who's using it maybe on pasture or range or alfalfa to do some early season irrigation this year?
Yeah, we had inquiries from producers about trying to have water available in May for irrigation of alfalfa and wheat and some pre-irrigation. We did luck out and get some precipitation in April from a couple of big snowstorms that hit our area, which kind of reduced that demand, and as a result we didn't come in May. We were able to hold off our irrigation supply and save it for later in the season to try to finish a crop.
For irrigators in your district, what's the emphasis? What do you want to make sure to point out to them?
We really want to emphasize the fact that this is extremely short water supply and encourage them to use their water wisely. I mean, we allocate per acre basis, so it's like a checking account for them. They draw on it when they want to, they can shut off when they want to conserve, and we encourage them to work with the district to try to maximize that supply. Our hope is to try to get to the end of August. Whether we can get there or not is going to depend on what kind of gains we get the rest of the season. 13
acre inches per year, are you confident that that's going to get us a little ways into the season at this point?
Right now we think we can make hopefully the middle of August. We're hoping that the gains that come the rest of the season as far as runoff from some high snow still in the mountains might get us another week or two and get us to the end of the season. We also have looked at possibly borrowing water from the Bureau of Reclamation from a Kendrick project up by Casper. They have some extra water available this year that we maybe can borrow. We have to repay it next year, and there's of course costs associated with that, but we may have to look at that as an option. We have contacted the Bureau and expressed an interest in possibly borrowing water if we need to.
The latest USDA crop progress report shows 96% of U.S. corn is now emerged, with 65% in good to excellent condition. Only 3 of the top 18 soybean producing states have wrapped up planting: Michigan, Ohio, and Nebraska. With 95% of this state's soybeans now above ground, and with evidence of glyphosate-resistant water hemp in Nebraska fields, we asked Lowell Sandell to outline options in soybeans for post-emergence control.
Folks are having difficulty controlling water hemp, or they may be seeing some glyphosate-resistant water hemp developing in their fields. Tank mixing, an effective post-emergence partner such as a Group 14 herbicide, which may be Cobra or Flex Star or Ultra Blazer, something like that. It's really critical that folks try to control water hemp as timely as possible because the labels on those products recommend 4 inches or less on water hemp.
Now for this week's weather forecast, we go back to the studio with UNL Extension state climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well folks, here we are again, time for the weekly forecast. Before we get to the main forecast, if we take a look at this past week, the 2 big items were the scattered thunderstorm activity across the state. Basically, there were some areas where we did get pockets of heavy downpours, but for the most part, fairly close to normal to slightly below normal precipitation, especially the farther west you went. And then of course the temperatures. We did see some very hot conditions develop during this period, and we also seen our dew point temperatures come up rather dramatically as we were pushing the 60s into the low 70s, made it for very miserable conditions. Then of course yesterday we started to see that cold front move through that did bring scattered thunderstorms to eastern Nebraska. But in retrospect, what that's going to mean is much cooler air in store for this weekend. It's going to be a beautiful weekend for most folks in the state. And then as we go through next week, we'll be watching for the increasing chances of thunderstorm activity, particularly as we approach the 4th of July holiday. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we may have in store. And as we go to the upper air models, the one thing I'll draw your attention to is we have this big ridge to the west, and then we have this trough that's trying to develop across the Great Lakes. And this is going to intensify and deepen as we go through the next few days, and it's going to push that high pressure system farther to the west and allow much cooler air to come in. So for today, we're expecting a northwest flow, much cooler temperatures, a little bit drier air. There may be the outside chance for some scattered thunderstorms, particularly extreme northeastern Nebraska. But as we go to tomorrow, you'll start to see that this trough dives down and pushes the cooler air back toward the west. So we'll start to see some relief working into western Nebraska, but very cool temperatures across eastern Nebraska. And another piece of energy may move across northeast and extreme eastern Nebraska that may generate an isolated thunderstorm, but we're not expecting anything major. Now, as we go into Monday, we'll notice that trough really digs down into the mid-Mississippi River Valley, and we have this cold fetch coming from our north, so very cool conditions will continue into Monday. And then we will start to see that ridge trying to build up toward the Canadian border, and this upper air low basically sits in place over the central Corn Belt. And as it does that, we may see pieces of energy pivot around this that might bring a slight chance for thunderstorm activity. But as we get into Wednesday, this low starts to push back a little bit farther west. And if it does, we will see an increasing chance for afternoon thunderstorms, particularly across western Nebraska, where we may have a little bit of an upslope flow component. Now, as we get into Thursday, we'll start to see this trough trying to move its way around, but we also got several spokes of energy that are moving through the region, and it's expected, if the models are correct, that we'll see scattered thunderstorm activity for the 4th of July, unfortunately. And then we will see those chances lessen as all of that energy drops around the southern plains. So the southern half of Nebraska has the best chance for thunderstorm activity next Friday. If we take a look at the temperatures, we're going to know some very, very nice temperatures, more spring-like temperatures to late spring temperatures in the summer, but then we'll be below normal. And we have those scattered thunderstorm activity chances during the midweek period. 8 to 14 for next Thursday through the following Tuesday. Looks for below normal temperatures to our south. In terms of precipitation, looking like most of the moisture moved to our east and well below normal precipitation across the northern plains.
Thanks, Al. Our interviews from today's show with Ron Plain, Brad Lubben, Aaron Berger, Jeff Bradshaw, Dennis Strout, and John Moret are available on the Market Journal website and mobile app as part of the June 28th episode. Next week, Carla Jenkins will discuss feeding cows in confinement, and we'll look at the variation in Nebraska's 2013 wheat crop. From the top of the Scottsbluff National Monument, I'm Jeff Wilkerson. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
A diesel-powered engine on a farm works hard and operates in a grueling environment. Soy biodiesel fuels stand up to the challenge of powering farm equipment, but are also renewable and environmentally responsible as well. The Nebraska Soybean Board is committed to encouraging the use of soy biodiesel to protect the environment and sustain Nebraska's agriculture. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.